My next duty is to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Jean-Charles Foucrier. He completed his doctorate in contemporary history from the Paris Sorbonne University, and prior to that, he got a master's in contemporary history at the University of Tours and Caen, which considered Allied bombings on the centre of France and on Tours. His research focuses on military strategy, propaganda, public opinion, and the historiography of the Allied aerial bombardments on France during the Second World War. Just before I hand over, can I remind you again, do please enter any questions you have in the Ask a Question box. Over to you, Jean-Charles.
Hello, I'm Jean-Charles Foucrier. I am a French historian working at Service Historique de la Défense. We are working here with the French military archives. I'm French, as you can hear, so I'm very sorry for my French accent, but I will try to do my best. Today I will talk about cooperation between Royal Air Force and French Air Force in the late 40s, and especially about diplomatic, technical and operational considerations. When the Second World War ended in September 1945, France stood alongside the victors and was part of the United Nations. This apparent success by General de Gaulle concealed a darker reality, with a country deeply affected by the defeat of 1940 and destroyed by the occupation and the battles of liberation. The industrial potential was greatly reduced, and design offices were far behind other nations. Some 60 major air bases had been totally destroyed during the war. The French air bases were part of a global strategy built in the spring of 1943, which was called Operation Pointblank. The aim was to strike the potential of the Luftwaffe in France and in Germany. Some bases, like here Bourges, in the middle of France, included an airfield and also an assembly plant which was building Schiebel 204, and both were totally destroyed. General de Gaulle's provisional government initially planned to give France back a powerful air force which could rival the British, American and Soviet air forces. The so-called 1944-1945 plan provided for the order of 5,000 aircraft and nearly 4,000 engines in order to reinforce the 1,500 aircraft of all origins that the French army was equipped with at the end of the war. This unrealistic goal contrasted with the real state of the devastated French economy. In February 1946, shortly after General de Gaulle's departure, the French Assemblée nationale voted for drastic reduction in the Air Force's resources. Here we have slide 2. Far from the initial claims of grandeur, the disastrous economic state of France at the end of the war required for a reduction of almost one-third of the resources granted to the Air Force. In 1946, the Assemblée nationale wanted just 50,000 men, 540 planes, 12 fighter squadrons, and only 2 bomber squadrons. Despite its limited resources, the Air Force had to meet 3 major missions. The first was to provide a support force to the occupying forces in Germany and Austria. The second mission was to develop a force capable of integrating with the Allied Air Force in the event of a new war. The last mission was to defend the French Union, which is the French Empire. This last task immediately overwhelmed the Air Force at the end of the Second World War, facing a high-intensity insurgency in Indochina. This type of imperialist war could not correspond to the anti-colonialist aims of the Americans, who blocked all supplies, unlike the British, who were themselves anxious to preserve their empire. In September 1945, an agreement was signed between Air Marshal William Dixon, Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, and General André Hartemann, Head of Liaison Services to the Allies. Here we have slide 3. The Hartemann-Dixon Agreement provided for the delivery of Spitfire, and about SOS-T radars, navigation aircraft, and training aircraft, as well as the possibility of training flight attendants for the French pilots in Royal Air Force schools in the United Kingdom. The Spitfires were immediately engaged in Indochina in 1945, and then during the Malagasy uprising in 1947. The French, however, were confronted with the use of foreign equipment which was no longer maintained and supplied by the Allies. 1 month after the start of the fighting in Madagascar, the French army was already running out of air bombs. Here we have slide 4. It's a document for French archives. As you can see, the French army was forced to urgently beg for the British for 3,000 aircraft bombs through the air secretary at the French embassy in London, Colonel Henri de Rancourt. The British responded politely by proposing to honor the order, but immediately specifying the expected price. Money is money. The problems of the French Air Force at the end of the Second World War was reflected soon after again in the operations in Indochina, this time with a shortage of 20mm rounds for the Spitfires, combined with a problem of compatibility of the guns. Here we have slide 5. So we have other documents from archives. The British Mach 2 guns of the Spitfires were used to fire French 20mm rounds designed for the Hispano-Suiza 406 guns. The Mach 2s were out very quickly, making them good in an attempt to solve these problems of dependence on the British. At the end of 1946, General Girardot, the new Commander-in-Chief of the Air Force, tried to breathe new life into the situation. It set out a 3-year plan to increase the number of troops to 19,000 and to provide new French aircraft to aviation while entering the reactor era. Unfortunately, the first 2 plans proved to be unsuitable. Here we have slide 6. Carrying the hopes of the renewal of French air ambition, the SO-6020 Espadon, which means swordfish in English, proved in 1948 a profound disappointment. Conceived hastily, the Espadon betrayed the powerful backlog accumulated by the French aviation industry during the Second World War, which had still not been filled. Only 3 copies were made before giving up the project. The experimental SO-6000 3-ton aircraft, designed in secret during the war, did not give more satisfaction, flying with reactor captured from the Luftwaffe. Its building was stopped after only 5 copies were made, leaving the French Air Force powerless to regenerate. At the beginning of 1948, the new Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Piollet, was forced to note the overall failure of the French aviation policy undertaken since the liberation. Here we have slide 7. So it's a quote from General Jean Piollet. The quality of French air equipment used by commercial aviation and the Air Force for both of these aircraft, the serious delays in the delivery of the equipment, or even the failures observed in the delivery of the prototypes, have created a climate detrimental to French aviation in general and to the aviation industry in particular. Parliamentary debates, reports on the management of nationalized factories, investigations into the aviation industry, press campaigns illustrate the current malaise and may have serious consequences in terms of national defense, on the general economy of the country as well as on the social level. We must therefore look abroad again and borrow the existing equipment. It is to postpone to a later date the famous welding between the old and the new program, which one could hope for in 1949-1950. Therefore, the Air Force postponed its independence in aircraft until the 50s. Like in 1938, when French aeronautics had already proved powerless to catch up with the Luftwaffe and had approached the United States for the delivery of Curtiss fighters, the Air Force was again looking for an international partner in 1947. After making a failed attempt with Moscow, the French took note of the nation's Cold War and turned to the United Kingdom. The aim was no longer, as in 1945 with the Hartemann-Dixon agreements, to buy only equipment, but to lay the foundations for a common alliance in an area bounded by the Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland. Signed on 4 March 1947, the Treaty of Dunkirk wanted to reactivate the pre-war Franco-British alliance against Germany, even if the new enemy identified quickly turned to be the USSR. The link between the French and British Air Forces began in December 1947, guided once again by General Hartemann, who confessed the French interest in the acquisition of jet aircraft, where the British had a definite lead. They were receptive to the sale of a fighter, the Vampire. At the end of February 1948, the project of a common alliance between France, the United Kingdom, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg took shape. The leaders of the Royal Air Force unofficially favored their counterparts in the French army, defining with them a favorable common position in relation to other nations. Here we have slide 8. As a logical continuation of the Dunkirk Treaty and anticipating the Nato Treaty which followed, the Brussel Treaty provided for joint military assistance in the event of aggression. It allowed France to confirm its place at the United Nations and the Air Force to begin to emerge from the severe crisis suffered since the end of the Second World War. Having become very realistic in 1948, the French Air Force postponed its illusions of grandeur to an indeterminate future and merely took advantage of the Cold War buzz to associate firmly with the Royal Air Force. General Hartemann summed up this pragmatic shift perfectly. Here we have slide 9. It's a quote from General Hartemann. "The Air Force is a legacy of the French Air Force of war. It is no longer as an autonomous ensemble as in 1939, when it was last in the form of a complete French Air Force. Now our goal is to bring logical and proportionate participation to the federal forces of Western Europe." Even if promising, the Brussel Treaty had not yet seen the integration of the Air Force into a common force. In May 1948, the British politely informed their pact partners that no equipment would be delivered to them until a payment program was established. Already annoyed by this economic problem met by requests for ammunition for Indochina and Madagascar a little earlier, Hartemann was visibly annoyed. "The first operation to be carried out is to determine the bill to pay," he said bitterly. Field Marshal Arthur Taylor, Chief of Staff of the Royal Air Force, eventually harmonized the Franco-British relations by being open to sincere cooperation. On 24 September 1948, the United Kingdom finally made the decision to begin its aircraft deliveries. Here we have slide 10, the so-called September 1948 plan. This plan provided for the delivery of 30 Vampire to France, and then a licensing agreement allowed the construction of 202 devices. French pilots, inexperienced on jet aircraft, could go to the United Kingdom for training. Radar coverage, another area where the French could not afford to compete, was provided by British forces to the Dutch and Belgian borders. In 1949, the French Air Force flew jointly on British equipment with 21 fighter groups on Vampire, 9 night fighters groups on Mosquito, 20 ground support groups consisting of Vampire and the new MD 450 Ouragan just entering service. The Ouragan, which means hurricane, is the first effective French jet aircraft, also equipped with a British Rolls-Royce jet engine built under license by Hispano-Suiza. Built to 350 units, the Ouragan helped to fill the gap suffered by French aeronautics during the Second World War and to compete with the best aircraft of the moment. On April 4, 1949, collaboration went to the next level, this time with a formal political military alliance. Here we have slide 11. The Nato Treaty pushed the rebels of the French Air Force driven by the Brussel Treaty. From then on, two missions were assigned. Air defense of the national territory, with the Ouragan fighter and the national aircraft under development, and second mission was participation in NATO, this time with equipment supplied by the United States, which reconnected with the military alliance with France. In conclusion, at the beginning of 1949, the Air Force succeeded in overcoming its problems and entering the Cold War alliance game favorably, largely thanks to the support of the Royal Air Force. The 50s confirmed the rise of the French Air Force with the prospect of the acquisition of nuclear weapons at the end of the 60s. We have last slide, and I thank you very much.